Thank you so much for joining us for this didactic teaching in the new paradigm, Perils and Pitfalls of Hybrid Grand Rounds. So my mini talk will be Hybrid Grand Rounds, incorporating a virtual component into residency conference education. My name is Laura O. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine at Emory, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-panelists, Jeff Hill from the University of Cincinnati and Ellie Alvarez from Stanford. We have nothing to disclose. All right, so congratulations. We've all gone through the Zoom teaching apocalypse, and we've successfully made it to New Orleans to enjoy our beignets. It's wonderful to see you all here in person. But it begs the question, so what comes next? So during the pandemic, many of us were tasked with rapidly transitioning, seemingly overnight, from our traditional in-person EM residency conference to virtual education. And of course, because we're emergency physicians, we made lemonade out of lemons and ended up with hybrid models that combined in-person with virtual education that was either synchronous or asynchronous. So in this first mini talk, we'll be talking about case series of virtual innovations that could be blended into this hybrid model. So the first case we had was of virtual grand rounds. So due to budget cuts and travel restrictions, it became difficult to host faculty for grand rounds. So ASAP came up with this virtual grand round series that invited national faculty in a simu-live experience. So that, for those that don't know, the 30 minutes of the lecture were all pre-recorded, but then the faculty joined in for the last 15 minutes in a live Q&A format. And actually one of our very first panelists was here, Ellie Alvarez, speaking on the topic of wellness. So there are some benefits to faculty. With this, you had the ability to edit ahead of time. There's flexible scheduling in terms of when you actually recorded the lecture. And faculty with young children often felt it was easier in this format. And there's also opportunity for mentorship and networking afterwards. With what we had was a virtual happy half hour for panelists so that junior speakers could get in touch with their senior speaker or co-panelists and potentially get invited to even other conferences. For faculty, junior faculty especially, this was an amazing opportunity to get a national level talk without some of the pressures of speaking live. And then for the benefits to learners, this platform gave the opportunity for small programs to get marquee level speakers to their shops and get a wide variety of opinions on various topics. With the ASAP Virtual Grand Round Series, there's also an opportunity in the QA session to really get a glimpse of that person's personality, because usually a lot of the Q&As were filmed at their homes. So you could see that Justin, for example, in addition to being an airway expert, was also a master drummer. So overall, the Virtual Grand Round Series was an equalizer of opportunities for small and large budget programs and urban and rural programs. So if you didn't want to rely on a national Grand Round series for your didactic content, you could also do it yourself with your own virtual Grand Rounds homegrown using pre-existing speaker bureaus. So there's the AWEM Speakers Bureau, the Feminine Speakers Bureau, and then the ASAP Ultrasound Speakers Bureau. And a neat concept for junior level speakers is to do a reciprocal exchange. So if institution A invites institution B, then institution B will automatically invite institution A for a swap of junior faculty. So moving on to case 2, virtual journal clubs. So Twitter journal clubs, sharing knowledge from a social distance. So I was first exposed to this during the pandemic and was invited to WashU's Twitter journal club and thought it was amazing. But you have publications going back to 2015 with Teresa Chan outlining how to do these online journal clubs. So this is 10 steps for setting up an online journal club if this is of interest to you. Michelle Lynn also did some work here as well. So a virtual journal club is a little bit more work than your standard journal club. So you have to prepare ahead of time, and usually with a core team. So you'll have to have someone who's not only the facilitator, but someone who's a social media expert who can help you with the Twitter. But you can also take a 5-step approach, prepare for the Twitter Journal Club, promote it, launch it actually, live stream it, and then curate the dissemination afterwards. And you can use web analytics to trend the use and measure your impact. So the advantage for something like Twitter Journal Club for faculty is that you have a broader impact. So your normal journal club might reach like 20, 30 people, but with Twitter you can get to thousands of people. And then you can track those metrics and put them into an educational portfolio. You could use it to create your academic brand and increase networking between institutions. So for the learners, the advantage for Twitter Journal Club would be archived conversations. You can engage asynchronously, like the next day you could leave a comment regarding that journal club, and also there are networking opportunities for this as well. Another example of an online journal club that's been highly successful is the Academy of Emergency Ultrasound's Probing the Literature Ultrasound Journal Club. So here, a luminary ultrasound speaker presents a landmark article, and then national faculty break out into small discussion groups, so you have the chance to learn from faculty from other institutions. And all of these are recorded and archived so that you could go back to them at a later time. So one example also of pooled resources of ultrasound faculty that happened was the ADAPT ultrasound curriculum. So in this experience for procedural training, about 15 institutions pooled 30 faculty, and they co-educated all their ultrasound learners during the height of the pandemic. So this was started at Emory. We invited all our ultrasound friends, and so all our learners were pooled together. So for example, on Friday, physics was taught by UT Southwestern to all of our learners. On Monday, Resurrection taught gallbladder. And so this is a way to offload some of the heavy workload from switching suddenly to a virtual format. We use a gamification strategy as well, so the different programs could compete against each other. And then Yale secured 2 butterflies for each program, so that each resident could practice on themselves or their pets or loved ones, and then the faculty would comment from a distance about their technique. So you can kind of see in this model how, in addition to traditional teaching, we had some augmentation of learning through use of social media, journal clubs, virtual grand rounds, and procedural teleteaching. So in order to sustain this kind of approach, it's important to focus on creating a community practice and improving communication and engagement with learners. And so my next 2 panelists will speak on these matters. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Hill. I'm one of the APDs at Cincinnati, and I will talk a little bit about sort of the social and cultural aspects of Grand Rounds didactics. And I think a good place to start is with a couple of learning theories that are informative as we think about Grand Rounds didactics and residency education. And one of the first that we'll talk about is communities of practice, and this was termed by Etienne Wagner and Jean Levé, and it was originally used to describe apprenticeship learning models. We don't classically formally refer to residencies as apprenticeships, but that's effectively what they are. It's basically observed practice with increasing levels of responsibility and expertise combined with classroom didactics. And communities of practice are basically a group of individuals who are all facing a common problem or perform a common task. They are characterized by the sharing of knowledge and experiences between individuals to be able to address the problems that they face and the tasks that they have to do. And they basically form and die on the ability to share knowledge from one individual to another individual. If there's no sharing of knowledge, then the community never forms, or it just dies. The other educational theory that's helpful when thinking about residency didactics is social constructivism. This was termed by Lev Vygotsky, and basically the theory is that internal knowledge is constructed by the social sharing of information from one person to another, most specifically from a more knowledgeable other to a less knowledgeable person. That could be a novice learner learning from a senior resident or a faculty member. It can go the other way too. It just depends on who knows what and who doesn't know what. But basically, the more knowledgeable other helps the junior learner scaffold new information on their old existing knowledge. And so the novice learner might know appendicitis as periumbilical pain that goes to the right lower quadrant. and anorexia and fever, but then the more knowledgeable other can offer up some other illness scripts like, hey, but what about when it starts as right upper quadrant pain or flank pain, or there's no migration to it. And in that way, the novice learner learns more things. So what you can see by both of those education theories is that it's really important to be intentional about how we set up the mechanisms to share knowledge amongst our learners and between our faculty and our learners. It's really important that we have like robust lines of communication that are present. So I wanted to present a couple of papers that looked at opinions about didactics and grand rounds during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a multi-center cross-sectional study that was a survey, essentially of 5 EM residencies, and they performed it was a mixed method study, like a qualitative analysis of survey responses in combination with just the raw survey responses. There's looking at the two most concrete ways to facilitate interactions between one person and another. Obviously, video cameras being one, and the chat function that's present on most of the virtual platforms. There was a little bit of disparities of opinion and thought in terms of how people reflected on their experience in using those. With videos, and more so, and some residents felt that having the video on was sort of more distracting. They prefer to have it off. It was more private. They could pay more attention. However, other people thought having the cameras on was more helpful, and some faculty thought that like cameras on should be mandatory to encourage interaction. Whereas the chat is sort of more universally loved by folks. In fact, there were some comments in the qualitative responses about how the chat made them interact with the content more deeply because they were able to kind of talk about it in a synchronous fashion. Obviously there's wellness benefits that are associated with virtual grand rounds. Whenever you're doing something by Zoom and you just have to essentially shower or don't shower and roll out of bed and watch the Zoom feed, then you don't have to commute and you get to sleep more, and both that's good. However, when they asked the survey respondents, faculty and residents, post-pandemic, future state, how much of grand rounds would you want to be virtual? And they only said 10 to 20% of grand rounds would they want to be in the virtual realm. Everything else they would want to be in person. This is a study out of UCLA that was of psychiatry residents, and basically, again, a survey study where they asked them to basically compare whether they preferred in-person or remote learning in a variety of different domains that you can see there. And really, the only thing that they preferred more as being remote, or the convenience of remote, was that convenience of coming to the lecture was easier when it was remote. Every other aspect of it they preferred in-person grand rounds or didactics. So, like, what can we do then? Like, how do we going forward foster some interactivity in the digital space when we're having to run virtual grand rounds or a hybrid grand rounds model, or even when we're back in synchronous grand rounds? There's not a ton of literature out there that says what the exact best practices are. So I'm basically going to share kind of some of the things that we did at UC that seemed to work pretty well. First thing that we did is we just used what we knew in terms of like a communication platform, and we chose to use Slack because we had used that for years in the past, running virtual grand rounds in an or virtual small group discussions in an asynchronous fashion. And then we also had a period of time where we had like a split model of attendance, where some people were physically present in person in the lecture hall and some people were at home. And we were worried if everybody was logged on to Zoom and trying to do the chat thing, then that would like kill the Wi-Fi access point. The other thing that we did along using Slack is that we actually had one of the chief residents that was focused on like watching the Slack conversation to bring up questions to the lecturer who was giving the lecture, because we found it really challenging for the lecturer to kind of focus on the running log of conversation in addition to giving their content. And then the other thing we did is us as the residency leadership team really tried to model the behavior we wanted to see very early on. And so we were intentional in sort of how we were wanting to openly share our own personal experiences of clinical cases that were similar, share knowledge and resources, articles, that sort of thing, and then give kudos and support. And then the kudos and support, like these informal interactions, I think are also very important. They're very well loved by our residents. They're able to kind of give each other kudos, share some emojis. And like when preparing for this question, like I guess I do have a dancing parrot one up there. That's good. So yeah, I got questions over what type of emojis we're going to include here. So like that sort of thing is fun. It adds a level of engagement to the content. So, and then like through our efforts, we actually have been able to create this venue of these secrets online discussions, which are pretty robust. This is actually from a recent talk that was given in person, and so we still have these chat channels open so we can have discussions online while we're having in-person didactics. And you can see faculty sharing their own experiences, asking questions. Dr. Broadstock is a resident here. He's sharing the ACEP guidelines that are there. They're sharing like resources from our FOMED blog. And so we've been very pleased in sort of how we've been able to kind of foster those dialogues. And then in terms of other things that we can do to encourage interactivity, anything that really works in traditional lecture prep for encouraging interactivity and getting responses from the audience works also in this virtual space too. So using polls like Zoom, the in-client chat has a poll option, Teams does as well. You can add an add-on to Slack that will do the same. And then like our residents just made an emoji poll here too, instead of like having to have it separate through a separate client. And then you can gamify things. You can break out into small groups. You can still do Kahoot. You can still do Jeopardy and that sort of thing. I wanted to come back to this issue of cameras because I think it's a pretty interesting concept. Very early on in the pandemic, we didn't require cameras to be on, and certainly there is a school of thought that there are like certain vulnerable learners who either are more distractible or maybe more self-conscious or have anxiety that don't want to see themselves, and that they may learn better if the cameras are off. However, there's also the counter is that, well, the cameras on was actually increasing connectivity among individuals because you're able to see people. There's a couple of interesting studies here that I'll highlight. One on the left here, the experimental study that's out of the psychology literature, and they basically looked at test performance for graduate students that were getting virtual didactics, and they basically had a group of people who had the video off completely, had a group of people who had the video on but they couldn't see themselves, they could only see other people, and then had a video on where they could see everybody. And what they found is that there was no statistical difference in test scores regardless of what experimental group they were in. In fact, there was a slight trend towards improved scores on the group that had the video on at all times and could see themselves. And then this was a qualitative study on the left with a very depressing comment that the person wrote out there, which I think is actually very relatable to any of us that gave lectures during the pandemic, to basically a blank computer screen, or you were getting nothing from the audience, and this feeling of like you're speaking into a void is very, very relatable. And then the final argument, I think, for having cameras on is for like professional accountability and absenteeism. Obviously, with modern technology, it's possible to basically tune into Grand Rounds from anywhere you would like, whether that's your home or the driving range or wherever else that may be. And so having cameras on, I think, actually is an added step of encouraging professional accountability. So as I said, early in the pandemic, we didn't require them on, but now, more recently, when we have had to have virtual or hybrid Grand Rounds, we've required them to be on. Thanks.
Try to walk around, and I just realized there's no clickers, so I guess I'm going to be stuck here in front of the thing, which is another lesson whenever you're trying to do in-person or hybrid. Make sure you bring your dongles and the clickers and all those things, because I thought they were going to provide that. In any case, I'm L.A. Alvarez. I'm the Director of Wellbeing at Stanford Emergency Medicine, and I was part of the ALEM Connect. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this thing that all of a sudden we can't really show up in conferences. So what are we going to do to reach out to our learners? And so a team of people that Dr. Michelle Lin gathered, we've met. It was really one of those fun things that we linked. I probably have not met several of them in person still, but we were linked through Slack channels, and we chatted about this idea of creating a virtual Grand Rounds. And I'll actually show you. So there's the QR code. You can read up more about it. We clearly tried to publish a ton about this work because, number one, it was really cool and it was innovative. There's a few things that we really wanted it to work. We wanted it to be a live telecast because, again, this idea of interactivity was important for us. We wanted to simulate a real experience of conference, even though the pandemic was preventing us from doing that. With regards to the back channels, you've heard already using Slack as a way. We were comfortable with Slack. ALEM uses Slack for their meetings, and so we tried to use the Slack back channels. In this case, I'll show you some slides later on. What was really cool was that we were assigning different people to just focus on one topic. That way, as a moderator, I am not expected to learn about, I don't know, underwater basket weaving because I have no interest in that, versus somebody else who might be truly interested in one particular topic. COVID was like a very common topic that we covered, right? We wanted to be focused in emergency medicine. So here's another thing that I will try, hopefully place. I heard that Dr. Hill tried this earlier, so.
Everyone hear me okay? Welcome.
Yeah.
To ALEM Connect. This is amazing. I think we were just doing a little early troubleshooting, and this is our first ever launch of a live telecast paired with a concurrent Slack back channel discussion. This is blowing my mind that this is going live. This initiative arose quickly, really after 10 days of planning. It came about in response to how all the programs, residency programs, had to abruptly shift and change their educational experience for the residents because of this unfortunate COVID-19 physical distancing
pandemic. I still get goosebumps whenever I hear this because that was really the first time that we launched it. And you can tell we didn't really know how to use Zoom as well. Our backgrounds were all over the place. The lighting was off. But we really wanted to try something different. And we developed it over 10 days of like meeting and just passing back and forth ideas. And the idea being from my design thinking is somebody says something, somebody will say like, oh, that's a great idea, and then it just kind of blew off. And Slack was a great way for us to do that. In the actual events, we would have like, so Dr. Babalak gave a lecture, I think on COVID in pregnancy. And again, think about like 2.5 years ago when it was like a very new thing. And she explained the topic, and then we had different faculty that would like kind of throw in their idea, throw in some latest news that we were hearing about, and trying to engage the residents and the learners. Another thing was we gamified it. Like we had, I think, like awards for like the most. So I think in the second or third iteration, like the program that had the most engagement. We reached out to each of the clerkship directors that wanted to be residency program directors that wanted to participate, to give them an idea of what we're going to be covering and also get them their own channels. And again, the goal was to develop the sense of interconnectedness, the sense of belonging, because we were socially isolating from each other. The virtual platform really offered a space for that. By the way, I have no financial disclosures. I will be talking about LEM because I have been part of LEM, but I don't get paid by LEM. Here's another one, LEM Faculty Incubator. The innovation here is using this program called Sophia, which is another way of interacting. So literally you have these like avatars that you pick, and then you kind of just walk around, you click here, and then it'll walk that way. And then as soon as you get closer to like BenchNap, your pictures will show up to each other, so then you can start chatting, right? So it's another way to simulate like a real environment, like an in-person environment when in fact it's virtual. Our medical school uses this for our interviews. They use this program Toucan, and again the idea is you can create like a mini lecture room and have people listen to you talk, and then you can interact with each other. for me, I think whenever we collaborate virtually, it's very important to have shared mental models. And one way to do that is just creating Google Docs with regards to planning. That way everybody is on the same page, and then you can add on to things without adding more meetings. So we minimize meetings by using like Google Docs, for instance. So I'm going to cover briefly here the challenges with hybrid grand rounds. Who among you here are doing hybrid grand rounds right now? Ooh, I'm going to walk around now. I don't need the slides anymore. Tell me more.
Well, we still have basically our current format, all of our.
Excellent. All of our residents are back to in-person grand rounds, but we still have faculty who join in virtually. So we still, we don't stream any small group stuff or whatnot, but didactics and such still get streamed so that faculty can participate remotely.
Got it. So that's pretty cool, pretty awesome, right? So people can access the lectures even if they're not able to show up in person, or is it just a faculty who's not able to?
It can be aside from showing up in person, but then I've also should mention that we also use it for residents who are on paternity leave and want to join in, or on away rotations.
So that's another clever way of reaching out or allowing residents who may not be there physically but still be able to connect. Who's had challenges with this? Because I can tell you I've given grand rounds as a person invited, and somehow I couldn't be there in person, and realize you're giving this nice talk that you think is very nice and you've prepared a lot, and you're talking to one screen because everybody else is in person, and then there's you. And so what have you experienced? He's gonna get me my steps today.
We have the same format that you said, and I think it's impossible to, the faculty who are at home keep putting stuff in the chat, but not everybody else is virtual, and so they can't see the chat. Like, so you've got the Zoom screen shared up on the screen that Dr. Alvarez has shared up there, and it's like, well, we can't see the chat because we're trying to see the slides. And you have a chat monitor, but the chat monitor doesn't always get across their thoughts. So engaging those people, I think, remains a huge challenge, because you're not, unless your chat monitor is like on point, it can be really hard.
So that's clever. What I'm hearing is that perhaps there's a way to have two screens. One screen will be the presentation, and another screen specific to the Zoom, so that they feel like they're included. Definitely, I've seen that happen, and I think that will work. I heard as well from you that perhaps you can assign a moderator or a chat person that their only job, is to look at the chat and try to amplify whatever it is being discussed, right? Our residents are doing that. If they're giving a lecture, for instance, they assign their colleagues within their class and say, hey, can you please take care of the chats, and then you take care of the chat, because perhaps, so assigning more than one person is also helpful, because if you assign one, eventually somebody goes to the bathroom or they get distracted or whatnot. But empowering is a good word for this, empowering people to do that within the class, they are also more likely to listen to the lecture. All right, what other challenges? This is great. Hopefully this is we're trying to do this on the fly because we're very early in our talk, and then we have some time here, and I feel like there's a lot of people here with experiences already. I can tell you that when I gave that lecture and I was only seeing one screen and everybody else with dots, tiny dots, because they're trying to show their camera away, that it feels lonely. Right? And you want some sort of interactivity. I want to see, what you're doing right now, you're nodding. Thank you for nodding. You're acknowledging that is a cool thing to do, right? That's basic human things that we normally would do, but in virtual world, we don't have access to. So how might we design a space to do that?
I'll go back to your comment before about the challenges of not being able to see things. That's one of the reasons why we did Slack. It's a double-edged sword, because then people, you have to have two screens at the same time, and so it can be maybe a little bit distracting. I think it's probably it's a unlooked at area as whether or not is this excess cognitive load and therefore not as good learning and knowledge retention, or is it improved because you're actually engaging and interacting with things more deeply, I think that's unsettled ground. But it's nice because like you can have the people that are there watching, they're obviously not logged into Zoom, but they can have their phone and see the Slack on there. Or another app, WhatsApp would be similar. You can also share files on that and that sort of thing. So
I can imagine if I was giving that talk in person and everybody is staring at their phone to look at what the chat is in the Slack, it'd be very distracting as well. Like, am I not interesting enough? Right? It's postprandial time right now, so like if you start doing that, I'll be like, all right, well, I'll blame lunch. But if the more you see that, that probably is not a good thing as well. So there's clearly a few experiences and practices that we do in person that do not translate as easily when we go to the virtual world, but also do not transfer easily in hybrid mode. And so at least being mindful of that and trying to figure out how to engage with the audience is helpful. I'm trying to do this walking thing, trying to hopefully engage this group, right? I can do that in person, but I can't do that virtually. How else can we engage people? So planting seeds ahead of time. So reaching out to the program, hey, I'm gonna ask a couple of questions. Can you assign some people to answer them, right? I had the honor of sitting right next to Dr. Santon earlier in the morning, and she asked me do you want me to ask you a slow ball question for your plenary? And I really appreciated that, right? So planting seeds for certain questions to be asked, and then empowering that person, because then it's not as intimidating for that person to ask, because then at least they know that somebody is helping them with those. Definitely, I think introverts do very well in the space where you can start typing your questions as opposed to speaking out loud. So understanding that as well, I think, is very important. What else? See, the 7-second pause in medical education works.
I remember having to give a talk sort of earlier on in the pandemic. It was an invited opportunity for another institution where I had already planned everything. I had small groups. It was going to be interactive, and then lo and behold, it's remote. And so instead of converting to an entire didactic, I decided to use still that small group structure, but with a role play in front of everybody, which did take a little bit of pre-buy-in. So that sort of softball of hey, person that invited me to speak at your institution, do you have a couple of residents that might be comfortable role playing with me in front of the large group, so that we could still have that? It wasn't quite as effective as having a bunch of little small groups, but they still got that opportunity to have some interactivity displayed in front of them, and thought it was valuable.
I don't have any solutions. I only have challenges. But I think as someone who's been doing the hybrid model for a while, we do a lot of question and answer, and there's usually candy as a prize, right? And it's just inevitable that seeing someone shoot their hand up first to answer a question is going to happen before anybody reads the chat screen. And I think it can be very exclusionary to the people who are at home. You're just not looking at their faces. And whether you are this is a question for at home, this is a question for in person, but then you're segregating. But otherwise, I think they feel like forgotten children if they're still there.
So the question for the group is, how might we create a space so that you don't preferentially focus on those in the audience in person versus those in the chat, or vice versa? Because I'm speaking right next to my laptop, I can see the chat better than if I'm staring at the audience. So how might we figure out the differences? Any ideas? I thought that was clever. You already are trying to figure out separating them, yes, there's some limitations, but at least you're acknowledging that will exist, right? What else? It's tough. But I can imagine that person who talks a lot all the time in person are probably just going to talk a lot anyway. And so, right? So at least you can acknowledge the ones in the chat. And if you know the group, if you know your class, then you can preferentially do that, and that's okay. You can create that. Or sometimes what I do is I launch them, at least in the chat, a private message. And this takes a lot more practice. I'll direct message them, saw your question, I'm gonna bring that up next. Hey, anybody in the audience have this question, right? And so you can at least make them feel especially in the chat, that they're involved. I can tell you I ran the wellness committee meeting yesterday, and 3 of our faculty who's been in our meetings like for years couldn't make it. And so they asked, is there a virtual option? And I unofficially created a virtual space because I wanted them to be part of it. But then I realized, like, I'm giving this like meeting to people in person, and then there's 3 people in the laptop. So literally, I was walking around with the laptop so that they can see people, and so when you say something, they can hear you, and then they can also speak up, and then people can hear what they say, and I just have to announce it louder. So that's another way of engaging the audience. But again, it's awkward, but this is new territory, right? Just like creating the LAM Connect was new territory for us. But innovating in this space is a great opportunity for scholarship. It's a great opportunity for engaging the audience, right? Because that's how we need to reach our learners. I don't think we're going to go back to the pre-pandemic, everything is going to be in person. I can tell you our faculty, they're like, no way am I going to show up every week for all the conferences, because now I can be a lot more efficient at home, right? And so what we negotiated so far is like maybe once a quarter of in-person meetings, and then the rest are going to be virtual. So finding those conversations and like having that as a space as well, I think it's important. Camera on, camera off. What about that? How about that? Like, how does that impact the hybrid model? Any thoughts from, not specifically to that question, but any other thoughts that I'm missing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that back to your point, like, it is super tough to kind of like engage that online group and then weave it in with the people, like whether they're communicating in chat or trying to like speak up over a microphone. The nice thing about the chat is it's there and you can answer it kind of whenever. And if you're the lecturer, like you might answer it, or actually another audience member might answer it for you as well. And so what we've seen with our synchronous online discussions is that a lot of times a person would pose a question ostensibly to the lecturer, but then it would be answered by someone else in the audience, or they could also ask questions of the audience. And so it was a lot more. The levels of interaction were a lot deeper than it would be just if we were in person, like you asking me the question. And so there was like a lot of more opinions that could be brought forward, which is the really nice thing about it, I think. And then but it does become super challenging. Like if we're talking, like we have this online space, and if you don't like attend to really good IT issues, which like no one had rooms set up for ideal like video conferencing type of thing ahead of time, and so you can never hear the person in the back who is like asking the question if you're the online space, so the person giving the lecture has to repeat everything, which makes the lecture like twice as long because they're having to repeat everything, which is a bit of a challenge. And so I think that there's probably like future state IT issues that probably need to be addressed to make sure that if we are going to stay in a hybrid realm, that we don't have to compromise how we deliver these didactics to be able to actually have them work well for people who are not present and in person. But I think the real question is like, how do you make sure that those people who are attending in the virtual space are actually engaging in the content in a meaningful way? Like that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, it's not so much the people in person, it's the one that's in the virtual space, right? If it's a majority in person, the people in the virtual space is probably the ones that are going to feel left behind. Any other thoughts, Dr. O?
So it's interesting that it's interesting how different programs balance this. So at Emory, there wasn't a high penalty for absenteeism. The focus was very much on resident wellness, and so there, even if residents had their cameras off, even if they missed, there wasn't a very large penalty. Yeah. But I was surprised because Stanford's so well known for wellness that there seemed to be more strictness. Yeah. So talk about your absenteeism policy.
Yeah, ours is very tough. If you don't show up to a certain number of conference, you get an extra shift. We expect all of our residents to show up to 100% of our conferences, right? It's very tough. But because we needed that to connect with our residents, especially during the pandemic, there were months that I didn't see a certain resident, right? And the only time that we would see them was in conferences. So we had to make that decision. It was tough. They hated us.
do you excuse certain rotations from that?
Yeah.
I mean, I see, yeah, okay.
There's certain rotations that are excused. You're allowed to miss, I think, 3 or 4.
Right.
And then beyond that, and even like with those 3 or 4 that you're allowed, the APD will reach out to you. Hey, I noticed you didn't show up to this conference. Like I train in the East Coast, so the East Coast will be like, why were you not at conference? I have to say something like, I noticed you were not there. Can you explain to me why you were not? Is everything okay? How are you doing? And it's actually a good way to check in with people. Oh yeah, I had a rough shift, and I just wanted to have a mental day off. And so then, as the APD, then I would be able to reach out. Oh, okay, like how are you doing? How are you feeling better? Do you need any resources? That kind of stuff.
You have another question for you.
Yeah, please. I love it.
Sorry, Ted Stettner. I'm the program director at Kennestone outside of Atlanta. So my question is regarding outcome data between virtual and sort of traditional educational models. And many of the people in this room grew up before sort of virtual learning was a thing. You showed a couple of studies that were sort of, participant perception of virtual versus in person. Is there any hard learning outcome data? Very difficult to study, I know, but on whether people learn better and perform better based on sort of our traditional model of in-person interaction versus a hybrid or an online type interaction? I mean, you guys may not know the answer. I don't know how you would find the answer, but there's a lot of smarter people than me in the world. So,
I will tell you my favorite answer that I give my patients at Stanford. I have no idea, but maybe some of my colleagues here.
Stanford had all the answers.
That's why I love that phrase. I have no idea. I don't know.
I have a small answer.
Oh, I love it. Yay.
That's all right. Better notes.
See, look what you're seeing here is getting
So my name's Inval. I'm one of the second-year residents at Kuya out in Central California, and so what I'm working on right now is a draft that's almost done, and we looked at our ITE scores, our in-service exam scores, because we were almost completely virtual for the year of pandemic started. So we took, end of February 2020 we took ITE, and then beginning of March 2021 was all virtual. And so for 2021, almost everything was virtual, and we just compared year to year. There was a small, not statistically significant decrease in our ITE scores. Was it the stress of a global pandemic, or was it this? But overall, you can see that, okay, we did worse. There's a lot of possibilities here, but it's just one small way of looking at it. We're hoping to get that published in the coming months. Yeah, but it was it was unobjective data point.
It's a good way to look at it. I mean, I think it's a very difficult question to answer.
But my understanding of the literature, like when they look at it experimentally on like a small scale for a small intervention, generally speaking, whether it's virtual or blended versus like a traditional type didactic, it tends to come out in the wash and be relatively equivalent. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a trend towards improve, sometimes decrease, but I've never seen anything that convincingly tells me that virtual is better or definitively as good. It's just usually a no difference type of deal. So.
I firmly believe whatever we decide to do, as long as it's learner-centered, it's going to be a lot more successful than just doing something that we think is going to be successful and not really including the learners from that. So including them in the conversation, I think, will be very helpful. I'm going to move this to the next slide, which really is more of the logistics. At least make sure the internet works. At least make sure the video camera works, right? These are things that I forgot. I wish I thought of. I did. I thought about it. Things happen, and then you forgot that there's no clicker. But these are things that you have to anticipate when you're trying to do a hybrid model. So hopefully today, you've heard about different challenges. You've heard about ways. We may not have solutions for all of them, but at least you've thought about that, hey, I heard from this SAEM talk that it's actually not easy to do hybrid. It's very not easy to do hybrid. It's actually easier to just pick one or the other. And yet at the same time, you will be in this situation where you have to do a virtual hybrid model. And knowing the challenges that we talked about will help you kind of navigate that, or at least prep the speaker that you're inviting and even the audience for those things, right? So even just asking, making sure a few people will have questions. So after a virtual grand round speaker gives a talk virtually, if there's just a pause and then they say thank you and then you leave, I can tell you from a speaker's perspective that's probably one of the most awkward things. I'd rather people engage with me and argue with me than not even acknowledge me and just clap, right? But we never thought of that before, because in person there's always this chit chat afterwards that happens, oh, that was a great talk, da da da. You don't have that in virtual space. And so I'm bringing that up as just another way of thinking about it. And also, somebody mentioned earlier, I believe that was you, that mentioned like how else can you get the people in the audience and the in-person audience and also the virtual space be interactive, like with the answers. We do this actually for our recruitment part. Again, I have no financial disclosures for Google, but I'm a big fan of Google Doc. And so what I do for talks, not for this one, unfortunately, is to create a Google Doc as a toolkit for the audience so that you can start writing notes so that everybody actually can share that note. You write down some key elements, people ask questions, and then everybody just focus on that. You're not focusing on one individual getting a reward for knowing the answer. You're focusing on the answers and the questions that people are bringing up. And the good thing about it is that you can take it home with you afterwards. The chat function in Zoom disappears after you log off, right? And so that's another tip for you to consider. I learned that from my vice chair of education, Mike Gisandi, like giving lectures and putting a QR code for your for a Google document. And you can even pre-enter some questions. So several of our talks this afternoon will have that. There's some questions that people will start priming themselves, and then people just start typing their answers throughout that. And then a way to engage them is to keep on looking at it and mentioning. And so, with that, we have 3 minutes left of your time. You can either have it back, or you can ask us questions, but really, truly thank you so much for engaging with us here today. Questions? I see smiling. All right, I look forward to seeing you in your talks, be it virtual or in person, and then hopefully you'll figure out all the questions that we ask here today. Thank you.